Quad 6.6. Alright, so this is a follow-up video to the Rapid Evolution frames. This is a 120mm frame. It's intended to be a very lightweight 3-inch build. And in this case, I'm actually floating on 2S, and the reason for that is I wanted to get the black box data. Now, if you went through the videos before, you know that on the 2S build, I had a lot of problems with this frame, just getting flyaways. But look, here, I've got it flying well. It's tracking set point really well on this little flip here, roll. And what I did to be able to calm it down is I changed out the props. So before I had the HQ props on, the Bi-Blades T65s, and those are just poorly balanced. HQ is just not doing a great job. And I switched them out with the Gemfan 2512 Tri-Blades, which are nice balanced props, and suddenly I could get this quad to fly pretty darn well, which was kind of nice. And it allowed me to get some black box data and kind of do a deeper dive on what the frame is doing and why it struggles sometimes. So now, in full disclosure, this quad is flying well, but it is on fairly conservative filtering. So you can see here what I've got on the RPM filters, basically the defaults with 3 harmonics out of a Q of 500. And then as far as the sliders go, I've got the slider position on the gyro at 1, so that's the default there. And on the D term, again, the slider position at 1, so that's pretty conservative. And I also threw on an extra dynamic notch, so and it's wider too. So I went with 2 dynamic notches and a Q of 300. And with that fairly conservative filtering, it works and the quad flies well enough to be able to get some data going. So that's nice, that's satisfying. In terms of how does this look, so a big part of what I wanted to do with this is I wanted to get the data to see kind of where the problem is evolving. And so the clue is when we go into the filtering, so this is on gyroscaled, what we can see is this notch here, or this little peak here, and something kind of starting to develop a little bit there, but it's not that prominent yet. And if we look at the general noise profile, so this is on the gyroscaled, you can see that although a lot of it, like we expect, you have your usual sort of motor band here, you have these kind of bands here developing, which this is your frame resonance. And we can kind of brighten that up by switching over to the D term. So this is, on the D term, we've gone ahead and filtered that gyroscale, and you can see that the RPM filter knocked out those RPM harmonics really well. But the thing that the RPM filtering isn't doing well enough is coming down here and grabbing these frame resonance bands. So you could see one here, and there's kind of like an echo of it there, but this one's reasonably controlled. So this is, basically we think about, okay, what's the culprit in this frame and why does it struggle? It's like, it's probably going to be this stuff. I also wanted to go ahead and compare this to, I kind of want to compare the printed frame to sort of the equivalent in carbon fiber. And that's I kind of dug into my box and I found a frame, which is the Warpig 124 cut in 2mm, which I think is much too thin for this frame. But weight-wise, this basically puts us at the same weight. And also, when you have the 124mm size in the Warpig, the arms are pretty spindly, especially if you got the 2mm. And the weight happens to be the same as the printed frame, the Rapid Evolution printed frame. So I thought this was kind of a nice comparison. And so if we start looking at the noise and kind of comparing it across these two frames, so let's go back over here to the gyroscaled. So if we come back over here to gyroscaled, so this is just gyroscaled on the roll for both of them. And if you look at these, the carbon fiber overall, it's not necessarily quieter, which is kind of interesting. But the thing that it doesn't have in the carbon fiber, we don't see this like peak kind of jumping up here. See right there. And it becomes even more relevant once we go over to our D term, what you can see is here on the carbon fiber frame, it's working better with this filtering strategy, and we don't have any of these low frequency peaks coming up, versus the rapid evolution frame. It's doing pretty good once we get into the higher frequencies, but it develops this peak, and that's that frame resonance. So when we go to our frequency versus throttle plot, you can see that band there. That's that frame resonance. And on the carbon fiber frame, let's do our frequency versus throttle, and you can see no big, at least on this filtering, no big peak coming through. And this, by the way, this is the same filtering that I've got with these. So I've set it up with the same, 3 harmonics 500, 2 dynamic notches, sliders at 1. So it's the same filtering between these two frames. And I'm literally taking the build and swapping the frame. So it's the whole quad, motors, props, everything moving over from one quad to the other. So I'm trying to make this as direct of a comparison as possible. So continuing down the line, I was kind of curious about, so my theory here, like when I was kind of thinking about, okay, what type of filtering strategy is going to work here? If on this frame, our motor band really is not the problem, or if our problem is these frame resonance, can we do something a little bit different and control the noise better? And so my idea here was to kind of filter this with dynamic notches. And here what I was testing is how aggressive can we get of filtering, but just changing the filter strategy. And so in this case what I did is now I'm at the aggressive filtering with the slider position at 2 on the gyro, and the gyro D term all the way at 2. So these are sliders full right, and I'm using the dynamic notches. This is 5 dynamic notches with a Q of 250, which is the equivalent essentially of using 3 harmonics of the RPM with this Q of 750. In this case, you can see I've turned off the RPM filter. And what's kind of interesting is that this this does not look perfect, but it flies. It's very flyable. And so this is pretty aggressive filtering, and although it doesn't look great, it's not completely falling apart. But you can see, so this is even into the gyro scaled, that you've got these pretty strong resonances here. This is, and I'll show you on the frequency versus throttle, that you got these strong frame resonance bands, and the motor band is being still pretty well controlled. Now, when we go to the D term, obviously this is going to really brighten up here, and you can see how, we're pretty borderline. I wouldn't necessarily fly with this filtering strategy here, but we can see where the problem is really developing. And what I think is really interesting now is, let's go ahead and compare. So this is an aggressive filtering strategy using dynamic notches, and to kind of prove my theory that the dynamic notches are going to handle it better than RPM, let's look at what happens when we try and use our RPM filtering strategy. So this strategy works great for the carbon fiber frame. So this is my my quad 66 filtering. So this is 3 harmonics with a Q of 750, 1 dynamic notch with a Q of 300, and the sliders both at 2. So this is kind of the equivalent of those dynamic notches in terms of latency, pretty close to it. But you can see how on this frame, because our problem is really the frame resonance, these dynamic notches are working a whole lot better than the RPM filtering here. So you can see how this D term is just kind of totally exploding and getting way out of control when we're trying to use the RPM filter. And in fact, this quad, you kind of have to do things to kind of get it out of that oscillation, but this is basically trying to fly away on me, and eventually I had to go ahead and disarm and come back to Earth because this was trying to fly away. So I thought that was kind of a really interesting sort of validation of the concept that dynamic notches aren't necessarily like an inferior filtering strategy to the RPM filter, depending on what your problems are. And this is kind of like makes me sort of a little bit more reaffirmed thinking when we're thinking about tuning whoops and stuff like that. So when we got these more frame resonant dominant noise profile, on those plastic frame whoops, then maybe these dynamic notches are really the way to go versus the RPM filter. And it's something to consider if you've got, a frame resonance and you don't know where it is, and you're getting flyaway problems, then maybe one of those strategies that you can try is go ahead and use the dynamic notches rather than RPM filters. And like this quad, you might get much better results, which I think is pretty interesting validation of kind of saying, okay, can we think about what we're doing and apply the filters in the most appropriate way? And this is a pretty good example of, yes, looks like we can. Now, for a final comparison, I want to show you what the carbon fiber frame. So remember, this carbon fiber frame weighs about the same amount as the printed frame. This is on my aggressive filtering, so this is with RPM. So 3 harmonics, Q of 750, 1 dynamic notch, sliders at 2. So nice and aggressive. And I don't think, me personally, I don't think that this filtering strategy is, or this frame is sufficient, because you can see that on the D term, there's a fair bit of noise here. This doesn't look pretty. Now it flies fine, and the motor temps were okay. They weren't too bad, but there's a little bit more noise here than I'd personally like. But overall, if we're just comparing the carbon fiber straight to the printed filament, you can see how much more trouble we have, getting into the oscillations here if we're trying to use RPM filter, or if we use kind of equivalent dynamic notches, you can see how we get these these big blooms of that D-term noise, of that oscillation, versus on the carbon fiber frame. Yeah, you still got a fair bit of noise in there, but it's not really blooming into those big, kind of patches like we see on the printed frame. So, what does that mean? On the printed frame, if we look at the noise profile of the printed frame, it's really not bad, kind of overall. But the problem is these resonance, and especially if the resonance are down low below the filtering, and especially if we're not applying the right type of filtering of using dynamic notches rather than RPM. So one of the thoughts I had kind of in general about the printed frame is that it's not that we necessarily need to keep it from resonating at all, but what we need to do is we need to think about tuning it so that we can push these frame resonance up higher into the higher frequencies where our filtering is going to be able to jump on it and keep it better controlled. Because this frame resonance, if you can keep it well enough controlled, it doesn't kind of really develop like we're seeing here. It stays more controlled, and the reason it kind of gets out of control here is because it's borderline too low. And even though we're using all those dynamic notches, this is really low frequency. So I think overall, if we can push, tune the frame, so that it resonates at higher frequencies, I don't think you necessarily have to make it a ton stiffer and add a ton of material, but I think if you shorten kind of like, the arms to some functionally shorten them up so that we push the frame resonance higher, I think the filtering will do a lot better on it. So that's what I'm seeing. Finally got some data, some black box data off of these frames. And so I was kind of happy about being able to do that. And, to me, this is the thing that needs to be most worked on to make these frames more robust across different builds. Clearly we can fly this on defaults as long as we have nice, balanced props. But I'd like to see these frames more robust, being able to tolerate kind of like, beat up props a little bit better or different builds a little bit better. And I think the real key is tuning it so that these frequencies, these resonance bands are higher where the filtering will take care of it better. All right, till next time, cheers.